"Objection, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted as Abigail Hart stood, her voice trembling but fierce, pointing directly at Police Chief Randall Crane. The gasps from the jury and spectators filled the room as Abigail dropped a bombshell. Chief Crane ordered the evidence destroyed. "He covered up my husband's murder." Chief Crane's face turned pale as whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, trying to regain control. Abigail, holding back tears, continued, "The dashcam footage, the witness reports, everything was erased. But I found the proof they missed. It's in this file." She raised a folder above her head, every eye in the room fixed on her. Chief Crane shot up from his seat, his voice booming. "She's lying. That file is fabricated." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Chief Crane, sit down." Mrs. Hart approached the bench. As Abigail stepped forward, clutching the folder, the courtroom buzzed with tension. She felt her knees weaken, but the thought of her late husband, Derek, kept her steady. When she handed the judge the file, he opened it and began flipping through the pages. His expression darkened with each turn. This changes everything," he muttered. Before he could continue, a loud bang echoed through the courthouse. The room fell silent, and Abigail turned to see an officer in the back, hand on his weapon. She realized the danger she had just stepped into. The small town of Willow Creek wasn't known for its scandals, but everything changed the day Abigail's husband, Derek, didn't come home. Derek, a mechanic with a kind heart, was the type of man who'd stop to help a stranger on the side of the road. That evening, he'd gone to pick up a part for a customer's car. Abigail had called him twice, but there was no answer. She figured he was caught up in work until a knock at the door shattered her world. 2 officers stood on her porch, hats in hand. "Mrs. Hart," one began, his voice somber, "there's been an accident." Derek's car had supposedly skidded off the road and hit a tree, killing him instantly. The explanation felt rehearsed, cold, and unconvincing. Abigail asked about witnesses, the condition of the road, anything, but their answers were vague. Grief consumed her, but so did doubt. Derek was an excellent driver, especially on roads he'd traveled for years. Something about their story didn't add up. Abigail's instincts told her this wasn't an accident. Days turned into weeks, and while most people encouraged her to move on, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that Derek's death wasn't what it seemed. She visited the crash site repeatedly, taking pictures and jotting down notes. One day, she noticed faint tire marks that veered sharply off the road, as if another car had forced Derek off. She also realized his wallet, which he always carried, was missing from the items returned to her. Abigail took her suspicions to the police, but her concerns were dismissed. "Mrs. Hart, grief can make people see things that aren't there," Chief Crane said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I suggest you focus on healing." But Abigail wasn't convinced. She started digging into Derek's last known movements. A clerk at the auto parts store remembered Derek stopping by and said he seemed uneasy, like someone was watching him. Another lead came from a teenager who had been skateboarding near the crash site that night. He claimed he saw flashing lights, like police lights, before hearing the crash. When Abigail brought this to the police, they brushed it off as nonsense. Frustrated but determined, she filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all records related to Derek's case. After weeks of waiting, she received a heavily redacted police report. Important details, like the name of the responding officer and the full witness list, were blacked out. That's when Abigail knew the police were hiding something. She reached out to Jason Meyer, a young journalist from the local paper. Jason had a reputation for taking on stories no one else would touch. He was skeptical at first but agreed to help after seeing the inconsistencies in Derek's case file. Together, they pieced together a troubling pattern. Other suspicious deaths in town, all ruled accidents or suicides, with ties to Chief Crane and his inner circle. The breakthrough came when Jason received an anonymous tip about a storage unit linked to the police department. Inside, they found a treasure trove of evidence: missing case files, unreported complaints, and even a damaged dashcam labeled with Derek's badge number. Abigail's heart raced as they played the footage. It showed Derek being pulled over by a police cruiser. The officer's face wasn't clear, but his voice was. It was Chief Crane. The video cut off abruptly, But it was enough to confirm Abigail's worst fears. Derek had been targeted, and the police were behind it. They copied the footage and left the unit before anyone could catch them. When Abigail confronted Chief Crane with what she'd found, he laughed. "You think anyone will believe you? A grieving widow against the police department? Good luck." That night, Abigail's house was broken into. Her files were trashed, and her laptop was stolen, but she'd been smart enough to keep backups hidden. She realized she couldn't trust anyone in town, not even her neighbors, who seemed unusually loyal to the chief. Jason suggested they take the evidence to the state authorities, but Abigail wanted justice to happen where Derek's life had been taken. As the trial began, Abigail became the target of threats and intimidation. Her tires were slashed, her phone rang at odd hours with no one on the other end, and she caught strangers watching her house. But she refused to back down. Every time she felt fear creeping in, she reminded herself of Derek's smile, his laugh, and the life they'd planned to build together. When the day finally came for Abigail to testify, she felt the weight of the town's eyes on her. Half the people believed she was a troublemaker stirring up drama. The other half were too scared to support her openly. As she took the stand, she glanced at Chief Crane, who sat smugly at the defense table. He wasn't worried. He thought he'd already won. But Abigail had the truth on her side, and a secret weapon. The sound of the courtroom door slamming shut brought her back to the present. Abigail turned to see who had entered. A familiar face stared back at her, someone she hadn't seen since the day of Derek's funeral. The person looked nervous but resolute. "I can't stay silent anymore," the figure announced, stepping forward. "I was there that night. I saw everything." The room erupted again, and Abigail felt hope for the first time in months. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the figure stepped forward. Abigail's heart raced. She knew who it was before they even spoke. It was Sarah Miller, Derek's old friend from high school, someone who had once been close enough to the family to know things Abigail hadn't even shared with her. Sarah had disappeared from town shortly after Derek's funeral, and no one had heard from her since. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a determination in her stance that made Abigail's heart swell. Finally, someone was standing up to the lies. I was there the night Derek died," Sarah repeated, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I saw what happened, and I can't keep quiet anymore." Chief Crane's face turned beet red. He shot out of his chair, but the judge's gavel brought the courtroom back to order. "Ms. Miller, are you prepared to testify?" the judge asked, his voice stern. Sarah nodded, but her hands trembled as she stepped toward the witness stand. Abigail watched her, wondering how long Sarah had been carrying this burden. The young woman had been so quiet, so withdrawn ever since Derek's death. Abigail never imagined that Sarah knew anything, let alone had seen what truly happened that night. As Sarah took the oath, she hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the defense table where Chief Crane sat. His eyes bore into her, and she seemed to shrink under the weight of his stare. I was in the area that night," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to be, but I knew something was wrong. I saw the police cruiser pull Derek over. It wasn't an accident, Mrs. Hart. It was no accident at all." Abigail leaned forward in her seat, her pulse racing as Sarah continued. "Derek didn't swerve off the road. He was forced off. He was trying to escape. I saw him, trying to get away from the police car. But then, they got him." A murmur ran through the room. Abigail could feel the tension thickening the air. She fought to keep her composure, but inside, she was fighting the urge to shout. Finally, someone was speaking the truth. "What happened after that?" the prosecutor asked, his voice calm but intense. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "The police cruiser blocked Derek's car. He tried to reverse, but they shot at him. I could see it clearly. They fired shots, and Derek, he didn't stand a chance." A collective gasp echoed in the courtroom. Abigail felt the walls closing in, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. This was the evidence she'd been missing. This was the confession she'd needed. "But why?" the prosecutor asked, stepping forward. "Why would the police shoot him?" "I don't know why," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "I don't know why they did it, but I saw it happen. Chief Crane was there. He ordered the shooting. She turned to face the judge, her voice filled with the weight of the truth. It was all planned. They killed him. They killed Derek to cover up something bigger. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Abigail felt the fury rise in her chest. All this time, the police, the people who were supposed to protect them, had been hiding the truth. They had been lying, and Derek was dead because of it. Chief Crane's face twisted in fury, his lips curling into a sneer as he stood up and slammed his fist on the table. This is outrageous. This woman is a liar. She's making this all up. You can't believe her. Sit down, Chief Crane, the judge commanded. You will have your turn. Mrs. Miller, please continue. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared. I knew what I saw, but no one would believe me. And then, when I heard about Derek's death, I couldn't let it go. I tried to tell people, but no one would listen. So I left town. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. Sarah's story was matching everything she had suspected. She was telling the truth. And now, it seemed the world was finally starting to see it. The prosecutor asked a few more questions, but it was clear that Sarah had already said enough. The jury was no longer just listening to the facts. They were now facing the reality of what had happened. Chief Crane was sweating, his confident demeanor beginning to crumble. Abigail felt the first spark of hope since Derek's death. Maybe this was the moment everything changed. Maybe justice would be served. But as Sarah finished her testimony, Chief Crane's lawyer stood up, a smirk on his face. Objection, Your Honor, he said smoothly. I think we've heard enough. Mrs. Miller's story is nothing more than hearsay. There's no physical evidence to support her claims. Abigail's stomach dropped. Of course, they would try to discredit her. They always did. But this time, Abigail had something they couldn't ignore. I have something, she called out, standing up. The courtroom went silent. All eyes were on her as she walked to the front and handed the judge the folder she'd been clutching. The dashcam footage from the night Derek died. It's in here. She placed the folder on the judge's desk, her heart racing as she turned to face Chief Crane. This was it. The proof. The final piece. The judge opened the folder slowly, his face unreadable. He inserted the file into the computer and pressed play. The room fell completely still as the video loaded. What they saw next would change everything. The video flickered to life. The grainy footage revealed Derek's car, the headlights illuminating the road ahead. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, its lights flashing. There was a brief exchange of words, and then Derek's car suddenly swerved, speeding off the road. The camera cut out just as a shot rang out. Gasps filled the courtroom. That's not all, Abigail said, her voice trembling but resolute. There's more. The second part of the footage. She handed the judge another disc, and this time, the video showed a different angle. It was clearer, sharper. In this footage, Derek's car could be seen driving at full speed, the police cruiser chasing him. And then, just before the crash, a second officer appeared, blocking the road. Derek had nowhere to go. The room exploded with noise as the video ended. Abigail's heart pounded. They had it now. There was no way to deny it. But then, just as Chief Crane stood up, shouting in protest, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom. The windows shattered, and everything went black. The crash was deafening. Glass shattered and scattered across the courtroom floor. Screams erupted as people ducked under tables, scrambling for cover. Abigail instinctively dropped to the floor, heart hammering in her chest, her hands covering her head. The sound of chaos filled the air, and in the blink of an eye, everything turned into a blur of movement. Stay down, someone shouted. It was Jason's voice. He grabbed her arm and pulled her beneath the judge's bench, sheltering her from whatever had just happened. Through the haze of confusion, Abigail couldn't process exactly what was going on. Her mind was spinning. One moment, they were watching the damning video, and the next, the courtroom was under attack. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. People screamed again, but this time, the sound was muffled, as if something heavy was blocking the airwaves. Abigail couldn't make out much in the gloom. The only thing she could hear was the rapid pounding of her own heart. Then, a voice boomed from the darkness. "Everybody stay down. This is a robbery." Abigail's blood ran cold. Robbery? At a time like this? But who would be trying to rob a courtroom in the middle of a trial? "Where is she?" another voice demanded. "The widow." "Where's the widow?" A chill ran down her spine. They were looking for her. She had no idea who they were or why they wanted her, but it didn't matter. She needed to get out of there, fast. Jason whispered urgently, "Abigail, we have to move. They're coming this way." Without thinking, Abigail grabbed his hand, and they crawled beneath the bench, making their way toward the back of the courtroom. The sound of boots crunching on broken glass echoed through the darkened room, growing closer with each step. "Do you think they know we have the footage?" Jason asked in a tense whisper. "I don't know," Abigail muttered, her voice shaking. "But we can't risk it. We have to find a way out." They reached the rear door of the courtroom, and Abigail pushed it open just a crack. She peered out into the hallway. It was quiet, but she could hear muffled voices down the corridor. "We need to go," Jason urged. "Now." But before they could step into the hallway, a flash of light lit up the doorway. The sound of footsteps quickened. "We can't stay here," Abigail said, her breath quickening. "We have to hide. Now." Jason looked around frantically, then spotted a janitor's closet nearby. Without hesitation, he yanked the door open, pulling Abigail inside. They crouched in the dark, hearts pounding, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Through the narrow crack in the door, Abigail could see shadows moving across the hallway. "Did you hear that?" one of the men said. Abigail held her breath, praying they wouldn't be noticed. She couldn't understand who these people were, but there was no time to figure that out. All that mattered was staying hidden. Outside, the voices grew fainter, and after what felt like an eternity, the hallway fell silent again. Jason eased the door open, and they slipped out of the closet. "We have to get back to the evidence," Abigail whispered. "They won't stop until they get it." Jason nodded, his face tense. "I know, but if we go back now, we'll be walking into their trap. We need a plan." Abigail's mind raced. The footage was the key. It was the only thing that could expose Chief Crane and his cover-up. Without it, all of this would be for nothing. They had to protect it. "I think I know someone who can help," Abigail said, her voice low but determined. "But we'll have to get out of town." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Out of town? Who do you know that could?" Abigail's eyes widened as she realized what she was saying. "A man named Marcus Wilder. He used to be a detective in a nearby city. He's the one who told me that the police department here is crooked. He said he could help if things ever got dangerous." Jason's eyes darted around. "Dangerous? I think we're already there." "Exactly," Abigail said, nodding. "We have to get the footage to him. He can make sure it's safe. If we don't, Chief Crane and whoever's working with him will destroy it." With no time to waste, they crept down the hallway, moving swiftly but cautiously. They had to avoid the main entrances. As they neared the side exit, a group of officers appeared in the hallway, walking past the door they were hiding behind. "Not good," Jason muttered. "They're looking for us." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She peeked out from their hiding spot and saw an open window at the far end of the hallway. If they could just reach it, they might be able to make it out of the courthouse unnoticed. Without a word, she grabbed Jason's arm, pulling him with her. They hurried toward the window, hoping no one would hear their footsteps. But as they neared the end of the hall, the door at the far end burst open. Two figures stepped into view, blocking their exit. Abigail froze. It was Chief Crane and another officer. "Gotcha," Crane sneered, his eyes locking onto Abigail. "You thought you could run?" "Abigail, get down," Jason shouted, shoving her toward the floor just as a bullet slammed into the wall above them. The world exploded in chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallway. Abigail's body hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of her. She scrambled to crawl toward the window, Jason's arm outstretched to pull her along. "Don't let them catch you," Jason yelled. Abigail's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt the cold metal of the window frame in her hands as she pulled herself up. The glass shattered beneath her touch, sending shards of broken glass falling to the floor. "Go, go, go," Jason shouted, helping her climb through the window. Abigail took a deep breath, ignoring the pain as she pushed herself through the jagged opening. She didn't have time to worry about her cuts or bruises. They had to get out. She could hear Chief Crane's footsteps approaching. Just as Abigail hit the ground outside, she felt a hand grab her arm, jerking her back. Jason had been caught. "No!" Abigail screamed, her heart pounding in her throat. But it was too late. She watched helplessly as Jason was dragged back toward the courthouse, his eyes locked with hers. His voice echoed through the night air. "Get the footage to Marcus. Don't let them destroy it." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she turned to run, adrenaline pushing her forward. She couldn't stop now. Jason had risked everything for her, and she wasn't going to let it all be for nothing. She didn't know where to go or how she was going to get there, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let Chief Crane win. The fight for justice was far from over. Abigail ran. Her legs felt like lead, but the urgency in her chest pushed her forward. She couldn't stop to think about Jason being dragged back into that courthouse. She couldn't afford to let herself be caught either. The footage, the one piece of evidence that could bring Chief Crane down, was all that mattered now. She ran down the dark streets, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every footstep echoing louder than the next. The cool night air whipped against her face as she pushed herself faster. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to contact Marcus Wilder. She couldn't risk going home. Chief Crane would be looking for her there too. She needed to be smart. There was one place Marcus could be. His old office, now closed down, had a back entrance that led to a small alley behind the building. He'd always said that if she ever found herself in danger, that was where she should go. Her legs burned, but she didn't slow down. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every beat matching the rhythm of her desperate run. She reached the corner, barely pausing as she turned onto the next street. There it was, the building, half-lit, its empty windows staring back at her like the hollow eyes of some old, forgotten thing. She approached cautiously, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure no one was following. It was quiet, too quiet. The street lamps flickered weakly in the distance. Abigail felt a chill creep up her spine, but she forced herself to push through it. Reaching the back door, she hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The creak of the door seemed deafening in the still night air. She slipped inside and shut it quietly behind her. The familiar scent of dust and old paperwork filled her nostrils, a bitter reminder of how long the office had been abandoned. Marcus's office was at the far end of the hall. She made her way down the corridor, her heart racing as she glanced nervously at the shadows that danced in the low light. As she approached the door to his office, she stopped. She thought she heard something, a soft, muffled noise. Someone was here. She pressed her ear against the door, listening intently. The faint sound of someone moving in the room beyond made her stomach twist in knots. She had no time to waste. Was it Marcus? Had he come back, or had someone else gotten there first? Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. "Hello," she whispered, pushing the door open just a crack. The room was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a figure sitting at Marcus's desk, hunched over and scribbling something on a notepad. Her breath caught in her throat, and her fingers clenched around the doorframe. It was Marcus. Relief flooded her chest, and she pushed the door open wider, stepping into the room. "Marcus," she gasped, rushing toward him. "It's me, Abigail. You have to help me. They're after me. They're after the footage." Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her quickly. The tired lines on his face deepened as he noticed the fear in her expression. "What happened?" he asked, standing up from the desk. "I got the footage. It's all in this file." She pulled the folder from her bag and handed it to him, her hands trembling. "Chief Crane. He's involved in the whole thing. He tried to cover it up. And Jason, they have him. They took him back inside the courthouse. Marcus, we have to get this footage out of here." Marcus took the folder, his face grim as he scanned the contents. He didn't look at her as he read. Instead, he seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes flickering over the pages as though piecing together some puzzle she couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You're right. This is bigger than we thought. If they know you have this, you're in more danger than ever. They won't stop until it's destroyed." "I don't care about me," Abigail said, her voice fierce. "But Jason, he's still in there. We can't just let them get away with this." Marcus closed the folder and looked at her, his eyes hardening. "We're not going to let them get away with it," he said, his tone resolute. "But you need to understand, getting this evidence out there is going to put a target on your back. And it's not just Chief Crane. There's more involved in this than you think. People will do anything to keep this quiet." Abigail swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had no illusions about what they were up against. But she couldn't stop now. Not when Jason's life, and so many others, were on the line. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I need your help. We need to get this footage into the right hands." Marcus's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he nodded. "Okay, I have a few contacts in the media. They can get this out there safely. But we'll need to be smart. Chief Crane's not going to stop hunting for you, Abigail. He'll be sending his people everywhere." Abigail's heart clenched. She had hoped that once the footage was in Marcus's hands, they would be safe. But now she saw how naive that had been. Chief Crane wasn't going to stop, and neither were the people who had been helping him. Marcus motioned toward the back door. "Come on. We don't have much time. We'll get you somewhere safe." As they made their way out of the office, Abigail's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, and her heart stopped when she saw the name on the screen. It was a text from Jason. "I'm okay, but they know who you are. Don't trust anyone." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Marcus, who had stopped in his tracks when he saw the look on her face. "Jason, he's alive. He sent me a message." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That's good. But it also means they're watching him. And they know you're involved." The weight of those words hit Abigail like a ton of bricks. She had just gotten a lifeline, but now everything was spinning out of control. Jason was alive, yes, but for how long? And who could they trust to help him? They needed to move fast. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight. "I can't let them hurt him." They exited the building quickly, their steps muffled by the sound of the city night. But as they turned the corner, Abigail froze. A black SUV sat parked at the far end of the street, its engine running. She knew they were being watched. The moment they stepped into the alley, the SUV started moving toward them. Abigail's heart raced as the black SUV slowly inched toward them, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predatory stare. She glanced at Marcus, her eyes wide with panic. "They're here," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Marcus's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "Run. Now." He didn't need to say it twice. Without another thought, Abigail sprinted down the alley, her feet pounding against the cold pavement. The sound of the SUV's tires on the asphalt grew louder, but they didn't dare look back. She could feel the rush of adrenaline surging through her veins, pushing her forward with every step. She didn't know how far they ran or how much time passed, but it felt like the world was closing in on them. The only thing that mattered now was getting away. The sound of the SUV's engine, now followed by the heavy thud of boots behind them, told her they weren't alone. "Marcus," she gasped, trying to keep her breath steady. "Where are we going?" "We need to get out of the city now." "I know," he said, his voice urgent. "There's an old warehouse a few miles from here. We'll lay low there until we figure out our next move." Abigail nodded, her legs burning as they pushed harder. She could hear the SUV's engine still following, growing closer. The streetlights flickered in and out as they ran past abandoned buildings and empty lots. The city felt like a labyrinth of shadows, and they were trapped in the middle of it. Just as they reached the end of the alley, a loud screech of tires tore through the night air. Abigail didn't have time to turn around. She just ran, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out everything else. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her side as she collided with a metal trash can. She staggered but caught herself before falling to the ground. "Abigail," Marcus shouted, stopping and grabbing her by the arm. "We need to keep moving." She nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. But just as they started running again, the sound of the SUV's engine roared behind them, too close now to ignore. They reached the street, but it was a dead end. A large, fenced-off yard blocked their path. There was no way out. "Over here," Marcus said, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her toward an old fire escape ladder attached to the side of a nearby building. "We'll climb it and hide on the roof." Abigail didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ladder and began to climb, her muscles aching as she pulled herself up. Marcus was right behind her, his hands quick and sure, but she could hear the SUV pulling up behind them, the sound of men shouting filling the air. They weren't going to let them escape that easily. The moment they reached the top, they crouched down, hiding behind a vent. Abigail's breath was coming in ragged bursts, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and fear. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. Then, the sound of boots on pavement echoed below them. The men had arrived. "Where did they go?" One of them called out, his voice low but sharp. "I don't know," another replied, his voice just as tense. "They couldn't have gone far. Search the area." Abigail and Marcus held their breath, barely daring to move. The searchlight from the SUV swept across the street, illuminating every corner, every shadow. The men were close. Too close. "I don't think they're up here," one of the voices said. "Let's check the alley again." Abigail closed her eyes, her heart thumping in her ears. She had never been more terrified in her life. The men were leaving, but they knew they were close. They had to move quickly. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Come on, we're moving. Now." They crawled across the rooftop, sticking to the shadows as they made their way to the far side. Below, the SUV's engine roared back to life, and Abigail could hear the tires screech as it sped off into the night. They were safe for now, but for how long? The following hours were a blur of movement. Marcus led Abigail through the back streets and alleys, keeping them out of sight from the main roads. They didn't speak much, there was no need to. Both of them knew the stakes. The more time they wasted, the more dangerous it became. As they neared the warehouse, Abigail's legs felt like jelly, but she pushed through, her mind focused on one thing: the footage. It had to get out. It had to. They finally arrived at the warehouse, its rusted steel doors looming before them like a fortress. Marcus quickly unlocked the padlock and swung the door open. The dim light inside revealed empty shelves, dusty crates, and a faint smell of oil. "Welcome to the hideout," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "We'll stay here until the heat dies down. It's the safest place I know." Abigail nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket, praying it was good news. It was another message from Jason. "They're watching the courthouse. The footage is safe for now. Stay hidden." Relief surged through her. Jason was still alive, and the footage was still safe. But how long could that last? As she read the message, a loud crash echoed outside. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. They were not alone. "We need to get inside," Marcus urged, pulling her toward the back door of the warehouse. "Now." They ducked into the darkness, just as the door to the warehouse's main entrance creaked open. The sounds of footsteps echoed in the night, followed by hushed voices. "Check the back," one of them said. "They can't be far." Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she crouched low beside Marcus. There was no way out. They had nowhere to hide. The men were getting closer. "Where are they?" one of the voices shouted. "Search the whole damn place." Abigail felt the heat rise in her chest. This was it. If they didn't do something, they'd be caught. "Marcus, what do we do?" she whispered, panic rising in her chest. Marcus's eyes scanned the area. There was a stack of crates behind them, but it wouldn't be enough to shield them from sight if the men got too close. "We have one shot," he said, his voice low but intense. "You have to trust me." "I'm listening," Abigail replied, her heart in her throat. Marcus didn't say another word. He stood up quickly, motioning for Abigail to follow. They ran, fast and silent, toward the far end of the warehouse. But before they could reach the back exit, a bright flashlight beam suddenly swept across the room, blinding them. "Gotcha," a voice said from the darkness. Abigail's blood ran cold. The flashlight beam cut through the warehouse, locking onto Abigail and Marcus. Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat as the man holding the flashlight stepped forward. Behind him, more figures appeared, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. They were cornered. "Well, well," the man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "The widow and the washed-up detective. Thought you could outrun us?" Abigail's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the exit was blocked, and the crates around them offered little cover. Marcus, however, stayed calm, his eyes darting to a nearby stack of metal pipes. "Let her go," Marcus said, stepping in front of Abigail protectively. "She has nothing you want." The man laughed. "Oh, she has everything we want. That footage, for one. Hand it over, and maybe I'll consider letting you both walk out of here." Abigail clutched her bag tighter, her fingers trembling as she realized what they were after. The footage wasn't just evidence. It was her last connection to Derek, her only hope of justice. She couldn't let them take it. "You're not getting it," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The man's expression darkened. "I wasn't asking." He nodded to the others, and they began to fan out, closing the distance between them. Marcus acted first. Grabbing one of the metal pipes, he swung it with precision, knocking the flashlight out of the man's hand. The warehouse plunged into semi-darkness, the sudden loss of light giving them a momentary advantage. "Run!" Marcus shouted, shoving Abigail toward the far corner of the room. She didn't hesitate, weaving through the maze of crates and shelves as chaos erupted behind her. The sound of scuffling feet, grunts, and the clang of metal echoed through the warehouse. Abigail's heart pounded as she ducked behind a stack of pallets, trying to catch her breath. She heard Marcus shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Her stomach twisted. She couldn't leave him, not like this. Peering out from her hiding spot, she saw Marcus grappling with two men, his movements precise but strained. A third man was circling around, heading in her direction. Abigail gripped the strap of her bag, panic and adrenaline surging through her veins. The man spotted her. "There you are," he said, his voice low and menacing. Abigail scrambled to her feet, clutching the bag tightly as she backed away. Her mind raced. She needed a plan, anything to keep the footage out of their hands. Her eyes darted to a metal ladder leading to an upper level of the warehouse. If she could get to higher ground, she might have a chance. Without thinking, she bolted for the ladder. The man lunged after her, his hand brushing against her shoulder, but she was faster. She climbed as quickly as she could, her hands slipping on the cold metal rungs. The man followed, cursing under his breath as he closed the gap between them. Reaching the top, Abigail stumbled onto the narrow catwalk, her heart pounding as she looked around for an escape route. Below her, she could see Marcus still fighting, holding his own but clearly outnumbered. "Nowhere to run, sweetheart," the man sneered, pulling himself onto the catwalk. Abigail backed away, her eyes darting to the edge of the platform. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she realized there was no way out. The man took a step closer, a smug grin on his face. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his tone dripping with false kindness. "Just hand over the bag, and this can all be over." Abigail's grip on the bag tightened. Her mind raced as she tried to think of something, anything, to buy herself more time. Then, her eyes landed on a pile of loose metal rods stacked precariously near the edge of the platform. She stepped back, her foot brushing against the rods. "You want the footage," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Come and get it." The man lunged forward, and Abigail kicked the rods with all her strength. The metal clattered loudly as the pile collapsed, sending the man sprawling. He slipped, his hand grabbing onto the edge of the platform, just in time to stop himself from falling. "Help me!" he shouted. His voice panicked as he dangled above the floor. Abigail hesitated, her chest heaving as she looked down at him. Her instinct screamed to run, but she couldn't just leave him hanging there, not even after what he'd done. Before she could decide, another shout rang out from below. "Abigail, jump!" Marcus was standing beneath the platform, his arms outstretched. The men he'd been fighting were momentarily distracted, giving them a narrow window of escape. Without thinking, Abigail ran to the edge of the platform and leapt. The air rushed past her as she fell, her heart in her throat. Marcus caught her, stumbling slightly but managing to steady them both. "Let's go," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the warehouse's rear exit. They burst through the door, the cool night air hitting their faces like a slap. Abigail's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to keep moving, following Marcus as they disappeared into the darkness. They didn't stop running until they reached an abandoned parking garage several blocks away. Marcus led them to the top level, where they collapsed behind a row of old, rusted cars. Abigail's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. Her entire body was shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She clutched the bag tightly, her mind replaying the events of the past hour over and over. Marcus sat beside her, his face bruised and bloodied but determined. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't break down, not now. "We need to get that footage out of here," Marcus said after a moment. "They're not going to stop until they have it." Abigail nodded again, her voice finally finding its way back. "I know, but how? They're everywhere. I don't even know who we can trust anymore." Marcus's jaw tightened. "There's someone, a friend of mine in the state attorney's office. If we can get this to him, he can make sure it's protected. But it's going to be dangerous." Abigail met his gaze, her eyes fierce despite her fear. "I don't care how dangerous it is. We have to do this. For Derek, for Jason, for everyone they've hurt." Marcus gave her a small nod, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Then we move at first light. Get some rest. You're going to need it." Abigail leaned back against the car, her mind racing as she stared up at the night sky. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. They had the truth. Now, they just had to survive long enough to share it. The first light of dawn crept over the city as Abigail and Marcus prepared to leave the parking garage. The air was heavy with tension, each sound amplified by their heightened senses. Abigail tightened her grip on the bag holding the footage, her fingers sore from clutching it all night. She felt a pit of dread in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. There was no room for fear now. "Stick close to me," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We'll take the side streets. If they're watching the main roads, we'll stay out of sight." Abigail nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The chill in the air wasn't just from the morning cold. It was the constant reminder that danger lurked around every corner. They moved cautiously through the deserted streets, keeping to the shadows. The city felt different in the early hours, quieter, almost eerie. Abigail's mind raced with thoughts of Jason. Was he still alive? Had they hurt him? And what about Chief Crane? The man had proven to be ruthless, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he had the footage and her. As they approached a small diner on the outskirts of town, Marcus motioned for Abigail to stop. He scanned the area, his eyes sharp and alert. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said. "But keep your head down." Abigail followed him into the diner, the scent of stale coffee and grease filling the air. The place was nearly empty, save for an elderly man sipping coffee in the corner and a waitress who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Marcus chose a booth in the back, far from the windows, and they sat down. Abigail placed the bag on her lap, her hands still clutching it tightly. Marcus noticed and leaned in, his voice a whisper. "You're doing good, Abigail. Just hold on a little longer. We're almost there." She nodded, though her nerves were frayed. "What if we don't make it? What if they find us before we can get to your contact?" Marcus's expression softened. "We'll make it. I've seen worse odds, and we're not going to let them win." The waitress approached, her tired eyes barely lifting to meet theirs. "What can I get you?" "2 coffees," Marcus said quickly. "And keep the change." The waitress nodded, shuffling back toward the counter. Abigail's stomach churned. She hadn't eaten in over a day, but the thought of food made her feel sick. Just as the waitress returned with their coffees, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. Abigail leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" "It's a message from my contact," Marcus said, his voice tense. "He says the state attorney's office has been compromised. Crane's people are watching them. Abigail's chest tightened. Then what do we do? Where can we go? Marcus stared at the phone for a moment, his jaw clenched. There's one more option, but it's risky. I know a journalist in the city, someone who's not afraid to take on dangerous stories. If we can get this footage to her, she'll make sure it goes public. Who is she? Abigail asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Her name's Carla Bennett, Marcus replied. She's been exposing corruption in law enforcement for years. If anyone can help us, it's her. Abigail nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. Then let's go. As they left the diner, Marcus kept a careful eye on their surroundings. They hadn't gone far when Abigail noticed a black car parked across the street. It looked ordinary, but something about it made her uneasy. Marcus, she whispered, nodding toward the car. Do you think they're watching us? He glanced at the car, his expression hardening. Keep walking. Don't look back. They turned down a side street, quickening their pace. Abigail's heart pounded as she heard the faint sound of an engine starting. The car was following them. Run, Marcus said suddenly, grabbing her hand. They sprinted down the street, the sound of the car's engine growing louder behind them. Abigail's lungs burned, but she forced herself to keep moving. They turned corner after corner, zigzagging through the city's maze of alleys and backstreets. Finally, they reached an abandoned building. Marcus pulled her inside, slamming the door shut behind them. They crouched in the shadows, their breathing ragged. The sound of car doors slamming echoed outside. Abigail's chest tightened as she heard footsteps approaching the building. They're here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the room. We need to move. Quietly, they crept through the building, their footsteps barely making a sound on the dusty floor. Abigail clutched the bag tightly, her heart racing. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Just as they reached a staircase leading to the roof, the door to the building burst open. Abigail turned to see a group of men in dark suits, their faces grim. There's no way out, one of them said, his voice cold and authoritative. Give us the footage, and we'll let you walk away. Abigail's grip on the bag tightened. You're lying, she said, her voice trembling. You'll kill us as soon as you get it. The man smirked. Smart girl. But it doesn't matter. We'll get it one way or another. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Abigail and the men. You want it? He said, his voice calm but deadly. Come and get it. The men moved forward, and Marcus lunged at the first one, catching him off guard. Chaos erupted as punches were thrown, the sounds of the struggle echoing through the building. Go, Marcus shouted to Abigail. Get to the roof. Abigail hesitated for a moment, her heart breaking as she saw Marcus fighting off the attackers. But she knew she couldn't stay. She had to protect the footage. She turned and ran up the stairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. As she reached the roof, the morning light hit her face, momentarily blinding her. She shielded her eyes and looked around, searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Abigail backed away from the stairwell, her chest heaving. She was out of options. Then, a voice rang out behind her. Mrs. Hart, I suggest you hand over the footage before this gets messy. Abigail turned to see Chief Crane stepping onto the roof, a smug grin on his face. Chief Crane's smug grin made Abigail's stomach churn. He was calm, almost too calm, as if he already knew he had won. Behind him, two of his men stood at the roof's edge, blocking any chance of escape. Abigail's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a plan. Give me the bag, Abigail, Crane said, his voice smooth but menacing. You've made quite the spectacle of yourself, but it ends here. No one else has to get hurt. Her grip on the bag tightened. You killed my husband, she spat, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. You've destroyed lives, and you think I'm just going to hand this over to you? Crane took a slow step forward, his hands casually clasped behind his back. I don't think, Abigail. I know. Because if you don't, I'll make sure Marcus doesn't leave this building alive. I'll make sure Jason's suffering gets worse. And I'll make sure no one remembers Derek Hart as anything but a footnote in a tragic accident. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Marcus, Jason, They were still fighting to protect her, to protect the truth. She couldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. "I'm not giving you anything," she said, her voice firmer this time. Crane's grin faded. He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward, pulling a gun from his holster. "I don't think you understand how this works, Mrs. Hart. This isn't a negotiation." Before the man could get any closer, Abigail took a step back, bumping into a small air vent behind her. Her eyes darted to the edge of the roof. It was a long drop, but if she timed it right, she might be able to. Crane's voice snapped her back to the moment. "Don't even think about it. My men will grab you before you take 2 steps." Abigail's hands trembled as she clutched the bag, her mind racing. Then she saw it. A small fire escape ladder attached to the side of the building, just a few feet away. If she could make it there, she might have a chance. She made her decision in a split second. Abigail swung the bag forward, catching Crane's man off guard as it slammed into his chest. He stumbled back, giving her the opening she needed. She bolted toward the fire escape, her legs burning with effort. The sound of Crane shouting orders and the thunder of boots behind her spurred her on. She reached the edge and leapt onto the ladder, gripping it tightly as her feet found the rungs. Below her, the alley stretched out like a winding river, its safety just out of reach. "She's on the ladder," one of Crane's men shouted. Abigail didn't look back. She climbed down as quickly as she could, her hands slipping on the cold metal. Her heart raced as she felt the vibrations of the ladder. The men were following her. Halfway down, she froze. A black SUV screeched to a halt at the base of the fire escape, and 2 more men jumped out, weapons drawn. They spotted her instantly. "There's nowhere to go," one of them shouted. "Give us the bag, or we'll shoot." Abigail's breath hitched. She clung to the ladder, her knuckles white. Her options were dwindling fast. She looked to her right and saw a ledge just a few feet away. It was risky, but she had no other choice. Summoning every ounce of courage, Abigail swung herself off the ladder and onto the ledge. Her foot slipped on the edge, sending a jolt of terror through her, but she caught herself just in time. She pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving as the men above and below shouted in frustration. "She's on the ledge." Crane's voice boomed from above. "Get her down. Now." The men below began moving toward her, their weapons trained on her every move. Abigail's mind raced. She couldn't climb back up, and she couldn't stay where she was. She had to keep moving. She edged along the ledge, her eyes fixed on a nearby window. It was open just enough for her to squeeze through. The men shouted for her to stop, but she ignored them, focusing all her energy on making it to the window. Just as she reached it, a gunshot rang out. The sound echoed in her ears, and for a moment, she thought she'd been hit. But the bullet struck the wall just inches from her head, sending a spray of brick dust into the air. Abigail ducked and threw herself through the window, landing hard on the floor inside. She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving as she looked around. She was in what appeared to be an old office, its furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The sound of footsteps outside snapped her back to reality. She had to keep moving. She bolted for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. She burst into the hallway, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. She had no idea where she was or where the hallway led, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind her. Crane's men were close, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her. Abigail rounded a corner and froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was Marcus, bruised and battered but alive. "Marcus!" she cried, relief flooding her chest. He motioned for her to follow him. "This way. Hurry." She ran toward him, her legs screaming in protest. Marcus led her through a series of narrow hallways and out a side door into an alley. The morning light was brighter now, casting long shadows on the pavement. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice urgent. "I'm fine," Abigail managed to say, though her body was trembling. "They're right behind us." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "We need to keep moving. I've got a safe house nearby. We can regroup there." Abigail didn't argue. She followed him through the alley, her heart pounding with every step. The weight of the bag in her hands felt heavier than ever, but she refused to let it go. As they turned the corner, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their path. Crane stepped out, his face a mask of rage. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "But it ends now." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. This was it. They were trapped. Abigail stood frozen as Chief Crane stepped out of the SUV, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto hers. The narrow alley offered no escape. Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed as Crane's men closed in. Marcus stepped in front of Abigail, shielding her with his body. "Let her go, Crane," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with defiance. "This isn't just about her anymore. Everyone's going to know the truth." Crane let out a humorless laugh. "The truth? You think people care about your so-called truth? By the time this is over, no one will remember Derek Hart, let alone you two." Abigail's grip on the bag tightened. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This footage will expose everything. Your lies, your corruption. It's all over." Crane's smile faded, and he gestured to one of his men. "Take it from her." The man stepped forward, but Marcus acted quickly. Grabbing a loose metal pipe from the ground, he swung it hard, forcing the man to retreat. Another of Crane's men lunged forward, and Marcus fought him off with the same determination, but Abigail could see he was struggling. He was outnumbered, and the odds weren't in their favor. "Run," Marcus shouted to her. "Go now. I'm not leaving you," Abigail cried, her heart racing. "You have to," Marcus yelled, his voice desperate. "Get the footage out of here." Tears stung Abigail's eyes, but she knew he was right. Clutching the bag tightly, she turned and ran toward the far end of the alley. The sound of Marcus fighting behind her tore at her heart, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Just as she reached the end of the alley, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. It was one of Crane's men, a tall, broad-shouldered brute with a menacing glare. "Nowhere to go," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He reached for her, but Abigail reacted instinctively. She swung the bag with all her strength, catching him off guard. The man stumbled back, giving her a split second to slip past him. She ran, her lungs burning as she darted through the maze of streets and alleys. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. The bag felt like a lead weight in her hands, but it was the only thing keeping Derek's memory alive, the only thing that could bring justice. Behind her, she could hear Crane's men shouting, their footsteps growing louder. Panic surged through her as she turned a corner and found herself on a busy street. Cars honked, and people moved about, oblivious to the chaos unfolding nearby. Abigail spotted a subway entrance across the street. It was her only chance. She bolted toward it, weaving through traffic as horns blared and drivers shouted. She didn't stop until she was descending the steps into the subway, the cool, musty air hitting her like a wave. She slipped into the crowd, her heart pounding as she tried to blend in. The bag was still clutched tightly in her hands, her knuckles white. She didn't dare look back. If Crane's men followed her down here, she'd be trapped. The sound of the subway train approaching filled the station, and Abigail pushed her way toward the platform. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open. She darted inside, finding a seat near the back. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. As the train pulled away from the station, she finally allowed herself a moment to think. Marcus was still back there, fighting to protect her. Jason was somewhere out there, a prisoner of Crane's men. And Crane, he wouldn't stop until she was silenced. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled it out. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know where you are. Get off at the next stop. Trust no one." Her blood ran cold. Was it Crane? One of his men? Or was it someone trying to help her? She didn't know who to trust anymore. The train slowed as it approached the next station. Abigail's heart raced as she debated what to do. If she stayed on the train, she risked being caught at the next stop. If she got off, she could be walking into a trap. The doors slid open, and she made her decision. Clutching the bag tightly, she stepped off the train and into the station. The platform was eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. "Abigail," a voice called out, low and urgent. She turned, her eyes scanning the platform. A man stepped out of the shadows, a familiar face she hadn't seen in years. "Carla sent me," he said, holding up his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm here to help." Abigail's chest tightened. "Who are you?" "Ethan Matthews," he said. "I used to work with Marcus. He told me everything. I've got a secure location where we can keep the footage safe." Abigail hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust him, but what choice did she have? She glanced around, half expecting Crane's men to appear at any moment. "Okay," she said finally. "But if you're lying to me—" "I'm not," Ethan said firmly. "Let's go. We don't have much time." He led her out of the station and into the streets above. They moved quickly, weaving through alleys and side streets until they reached an unmarked car parked in a dimly lit lot. "Get in," Ethan said, opening the passenger door for her. Abigail climbed in, her heart still racing. As Ethan started the car and pulled out of the lot, she clutched the bag tightly, her mind racing. She didn't know where they were going or if she could truly trust Ethan, but one thing was clear. The fight wasn't over. And she wasn't going to stop until Derek got the justice he deserved. Abigail sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the bag tightly as Ethan drove through the dimly lit streets. Her mind replayed the events of the past few days in an endless loop: Derek's death, the trial, Jason's capture, Marcus's sacrifice. Everything had led to this moment, and the weight of it was suffocating. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breaking the tense silence. Ethan glanced at her briefly. "There's a safe house just outside the city. Carla's already there. Once we get the footage to her, she'll make sure it's released to every major news outlet in the country." Abigail nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She wasn't sure if she could trust Ethan, but at this point, she had no choice. The streets blurred past the window as they drove, the quiet hum of the car engine the only sound. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, they arrived at an old, nondescript building tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Ethan parked the car and stepped out, motioning for Abigail to follow. She clutched the bag tightly as she stepped into the cold night air, her heart pounding. "This way," Ethan said, leading her toward a side entrance. He knocked twice, then paused, before knocking 3 more times. The door creaked open, and a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor stood in the doorway. "Abigail Hart," the woman said, her voice steady. "I'm Carla Bennett. You've done well to make it this far." Abigail felt a rush of relief, but also a pang of doubt. "You're the journalist?" Carla nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "I've been tracking Crane and his operation for years. This footage will finally expose him and everyone involved." Inside, the room was dimly lit, with maps, photographs, and documents spread across the walls and tables. It was a makeshift command center, and Abigail realized just how serious Carla was about her mission. "Let me see it," Carla said, holding out her hand. Abigail hesitated for a moment before handing over the bag. Carla unzipped it and pulled out the files and the flash drive containing the footage. She studied the documents briefly, her expression hardening. "This is it," Carla said, her voice filled with conviction. "This is what we need to bring him down." Abigail felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. "What happens now? Crane won't stop. He'll come after all of us." Carla's lips curved into a determined smile. "Let him try. Once this goes public, he'll have nowhere to hide." She turned to a laptop on the table and began uploading the footage. Abigail watched as the video played on the screen. The dashcam footage of Derek being pulled over, the chase, the fatal crash. It was all there, undeniable and unedited. As the upload bar filled, Abigail's chest tightened. This was it. The truth was finally going to come out. But then, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the moment. Abigail froze, her heart dropping as she heard voices shouting and heavy boots hitting the ground. "They're here," Ethan said, pulling a gun from his jacket. "They must have tracked us." Carla's face hardened. "We don't have time to run. The upload's almost done. We hold them off until it finishes." Abigail's pulse raced as the door shook violently, someone pounding on it from the other side. "Open up," a voice bellowed. "We know you're in there." Ethan moved to the door, his weapon drawn, while Carla stood protectively in front of the laptop. Abigail felt utterly helpless, her hands shaking as she looked for something, anything that could help. The door burst open, and Crane's men flooded in, their weapons raised. Ethan fired the first shot, taking down one of them, but the others pushed forward, their sheer numbers overwhelming him. Abigail grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table and swung it at the nearest man, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, giving her a moment to dart toward the laptop. The upload bar was at 90%. They just needed a little more time. Carla grabbed a chair and used it to block another attacker, her determination unshakable. "Abigail, protect the laptop," she shouted. Abigail turned to see Crane step through the doorway, his cold eyes locking onto her. He raised his gun, aiming it directly at her. "It's over, Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice calm but deadly. "You've lost." Abigail's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. "No, Crane. You have." The upload bar hit 100%. The sound of a loud beep filled the room, and Carla let out a triumphant laugh. "It's done," she shouted. "The footage is live. Every major outlet has it now. You're finished, Crane." For the first time, Abigail saw a flicker of fear in Crane's eyes. His composure faltered, and he looked at the laptop, then back at Abigail. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "You think the truth matters?" "It always matters," Abigail said, her voice steady. Before Crane could react, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and the room erupted into chaos as law enforcement swarmed the building. Crane's men tried to flee, but it was too late. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting orders. Crane turned to run, but Abigail stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere." Two officers grabbed Crane, wrestling him to the ground as he cursed and struggled. Abigail watched as they handcuffed him, the weight of the moment finally hitting her. It was over. Carla walked over, placing a hand on Abigail's shoulder. "You did it," she said. "You stood up to him, and now the whole world will know the truth." Abigail nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time since Derek's death, she felt a sense of peace. Justice had been served, and Derek's memory would not be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the footage sparked a nationwide outcry. Chief Crane and his entire operation were exposed, leading to arrests and investigations across multiple agencies. Abigail became a symbol of courage, her story inspiring others to stand up against corruption. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Abigail knew one thing for sure. Derek's legacy would live on, and she would never stop fighting for justice. The fight had cost her dearly, but in the end, the truth had prevailed.